September 18, 1935. Bawdsey Manor, Suffolk, England. The North Sea winds whipped across the cliffs, biting through the wool of coats, rattling the windows of the old manor. Inside, the room smelled of metal, ozone, and nervous anticipation. Robert Watson Watt, a man with steel-grey hair and eyes that seemed to see the invisible, leaned over a cluttered table of oscilloscopes, radio transmitters, and tangled wires. Each device hummed in anxious synchrony, as though aware of the enormity of what was about to happen. He adjusted the receiver dial and squinted at the oscilloscope. The screen flickered with a faint, wavering line, dancing like a heartbeat. Outside, the gulls cried over the churning sea, oblivious to the tension indoors. Watson Watt's assistant, Arnold Wilkins, stood beside him, holding a notebook soaked with ink and ambition. "If we're right," Wilkins said, voice tight, "we should see the plane long before it's over the horizon." And then it happened. A tiny blip, a subtle pulse reflected back from an aircraft hundreds of meters away, shimmered across the cathode tube. The room held its breath. Watson Watt's hand trembled slightly as he marked the time and distance. "It's there," he said, almost a whisper, though the words carried the weight of a revelation. The invisible had become visible. The British Air Ministry had been skeptical, dismissing ideas of death rays and fantastical machines. But Watson Watt had turned speculation into measurable signals. He had proposed using radio waves, the same signals bouncing invisibly across the landscape, to detect aircraft. Each reflected pulse, each tiny echo on the screen, was a lifeline against the shadow of Hitler's growing Luftwaffe. By 1936, the government was convinced enough to invest. A series of experimental stations dotted the coastlines, Bawdsey, Dover, and later, the Shetlands. Towering steel structures rose from the sands, their transmitter arrays slicing into the sky like skeletal fingers pointing toward the continent. Each tower bristled with antennas, cables snaking like veins through wooden walkways, humming with electrical life. Operators, often young and jittery, monitored dials and charts, listening to the static, the hiss of incoming pulses, translating the invisible into actionable intelligence. The work was exhausting, monotonous, yet electrifying. Nights were the hardest. Storm clouds rolled over the North Sea, lightning illuminating the darkened towers in sudden, white flashes. Rain spat against metal roofs. Inside, operators wrapped in blankets over uniforms plotted every blip, every reflection of an aircraft slicing through the sky. The first true test came not from enemy planes, but from practice flights by the RAF. Yet even then, miscalculations and false readings haunted the experiment. Each blip could mean life or death, each misread echo a potential disaster. Watson Watt paced the observation deck of Bawdsey Manor one night, his eyes tracing the faint horizon beyond the cliffs. "A machine can't replace vigilance," he muttered to himself, but he also knew the machine could augment it. This invisible shield, composed of radio waves, steel towers, and human calculation, would give Britain a window, a precious, sometimes brief warning of the storms to come. By 1937, the chain-home concept was fully formed, a series of radar stations along the coast transmitting and receiving radio pulses, each feeding information into a central operations room. Maps were spread across tables, tiny markers representing aircraft, arrows drawn with chalk to indicate heading and altitude. The Observer Corps, recruited from civilians, worked in tandem with the radar stations, confirming sightings with binoculars and telephone reports. It was a dance of technology and human intuition, a choreography of detection and prediction. Tension rose as reports of Luftwaffe expansion in Germany became undeniable. Air bases bristled with aircraft, new models faster and deadlier than anything Britain had. If war came, it would arrive from the skies first. Every test, Every echo of a plane over Bordsey was a rehearsal for the inevitable. And then came the first small victories. During a training exercise in 1938, radar operators detected aircraft over the North Sea long before visual contact was possible. Spitfires and Hurricanes scrambled on the order of minutes instead of hours. The experiment had proven its worth, but the true test lay ahead, when the stakes were no longer theoretical and the enemy real. Watson Watt understood the magnitude of the moment. Radar was not a weapon in itself, not a gun or a plane, but a guardian, a shield of invisible pulses and reflected energy. It was silent, unseen, yet omnipresent. And as he stood watching the North Sea horizon, listening to the faint, regular ping of the transmitter, he knew Britain was building something that could tip the balance in the skies above, an invisible, unrelenting shield born from science, necessity, and the urgent pulse of history itself. June 14th, 1939. The cliffs above Dover were slick with rain, the chalk-white stone glinting beneath a dull, grey sky. Wind tore across the coast, scattering loose papers and rattling the rigging on the steel transmitter towers that now loomed like sentinels against the English Channel. Men in wool coats and flat caps struggled against the gusts, hauling cables and adjusting antenna arrays, while engineers traced currents through oscilloscopes and spark gap detectors. The chain-home network was no longer theory. It was a physical presence along Britain's eastern seaboard, each station a node in a growing web of electronic eyes. At one of the central stations, Lieutenant Edward Eddie Patterson crouched in front of a receiver, pencil poised over a chart. Each blip on the cathode screen represented an aircraft hundreds of miles away, invisible to the naked eye. Sweat mixed with rainwater as he adjusted the dials. "Altitude estimate, 3,000 feet, he muttered, signaling to a nearby operator who began relaying instructions to a scrambled fighter squadron. The process was a ballet of precision, the culmination of years of work by Watson Watt, Wilkins, and the thousands of men and women now scattered across Britain. The stations themselves were marvels of functional design. Tall latticed towers, some over 350 feet high, bristled with transmitters and receivers, each pulsing rhythmically with radio energy. Below, operations rooms were filled with plotting tables, phones ringing incessantly, operators leaning over maps dotted with markers indicating every detected aircraft. It was a blend of brute physics and human intuition, a system that relied on both the accuracy of technology and the discipline of trained eyes. In 1940, the German threat loomed larger than ever. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights had begun over the North Sea, probing defenses, testing response times. Chain-home operators often worked through nights of rain, their eyes red from fatigue, hands clumsy from cold, yet each ping and echo mattered. They were the unseen front line, translating invisible radio waves into actionable intelligence that would determine the fate of the skies above Britain. Meanwhile, Watson Watt moved between stations like a general inspecting his troops. Though he rarely fired a gun or flew a sortie, his mind orchestrated an invisible war of detection. "Remember," he would tell the operators, "we do not fight with bullets, but with knowledge. The faster we know, the faster the fighters fly, and the more lives we save." His calm, measured presence inspired confidence, though few outside the radar community truly understood the complexity or impact of the work. By mid-1940, the chain-home network covered almost the entire eastern coast, from the Scottish Highlands down to the cliffs of Dover. Each station could detect incoming aircraft at ranges of up to 120 miles, giving the RAF precious minutes to scramble fighters. The system was not perfect. False echoes and environmental interference plagued operations, but it was far superior to anything the Luftwaffe anticipated. Germany had developed aircraft and training, but the British had mastered the unseen battlefield of radio waves. The effectiveness of chain-home became evident during the Battle of Britain. On August 15, 1940, at precisely 11:02 a.m., operators at Dover reported a formation of Heinkel He-111 bombers approaching from the east. Within minutes, fighters were airborne, vectored toward the incoming threat with precision. Pilots later recounted the near-uncanny timing, scrambling just moments before the bombers reached coastal towns. Without radar, the Luftwaffe would have struck with devastating surprise. With it, the RAF had forewarning, coordination, and a chance to fight on equal terms. Each station had its own character and challenges. At Bawdsey, operators contended with fog so thick it obliterated the horizon. At Rye, summer thunderstorms turned the air into a tapestry of static and interference. Yet across the network, a rhythm emerged, a pulse that echoed through every tower, every plotting room, every communication line. This pulse was the lifeblood of Britain's early warning system, a silent but steadfast guardian against the gathering storm. The men and women who ran the stations rarely saw combat, yet their contribution was heroic. They endured monotonous shifts, bitter cold, and the constant pressure of knowing that a single missed blip could mean disaster. Through it all, chain home operators maintained vigilance, a combination of discipline, training, and sheer grit that transformed the nation's air defenses. By the time the Luftwaffe launched the first waves over London and the southeast in August 1940, the radar network had matured. It became a force multiplier, allowing the RAF to conserve resources, deploy fighters efficiently, and counter attacks with deadly precision. Britain's invisible shield was now operational, a combination of human resolve and technological ingenuity that would play a decisive role in the Battle of Britain. August 12, 1940. Dawn was reluctant to break through the low-hanging clouds above Kent, England. Mist clung to the rolling fields, and the smell of wet earth mingled with coal smoke from nearby chimneys. In the Bawdsey radar operations room, a cluster of operators hunched over plotting tables, their faces pale in the glow of cathode screens. Every moment mattered. Each blip was a potential threat, each echo a possible harbinger of destruction. 16 aircraft, heading southeast, altitude 12,000 feet, called out Sergeant Milburn, voice taut with focus. Fingers danced across the plotting board, moving markers along grids that represented the skies above England. A young operator, barely 19, double-checked the reading, eyes wide with tension. Outside, the wind rattled the steel lattice of the towers as if nature itself was aware of the impending storm. At RAF Fighter Command Headquarters in Uxbridge, Group Captain Sir Hugh Dowding leaned over a large plotting table, listening to updates relayed from radar stations along the coast. Telephones rang incessantly, and runners carried messages between rooms. The room smelled faintly of smoke from a nearby stove and the iron tang of wet wool coats. Each message from Chain Home was a lifeline. Each confirmed sighting allowed him to direct Spitfires and Hurricanes with a precision that would have been impossible in previous wars. Meanwhile, over the Channel, Luftwaffe formations moved with deadly intent, unaware of the electronic web tightening around them. Messerschmitt Bf-109s zipped ahead of Heinkel 111s, their engines cutting through the mist. Pilots squinted against the low sun, scanning for the coastline, for any sign of resistance. But what they did not know was that Britain was already watching, every movement anticipated, every approach tracked. Radar operators at Dover adjusted the transmitter power, focusing the beams along the predicted flight path. Watson Watt, having arrived to inspect the station, stood silently behind the team, observing the coordination. His sharp eyes missed nothing, the flicker of a cathode screen, the slight hesitation in an operator's movements, the rapid marking of aircraft positions on plotting charts. "Keep your markers updated," he murmured, voice calm but firm. "Time is the difference between interception and disaster." Minutes stretched into tense hours. Reports flowed in from multiple chain home stations, aircraft numbers, formations, altitudes, estimated speeds. Each update was processed and relayed to fighter controllers, who scrambled aircraft accordingly. Pilots, still yawning from early morning shifts, received precise vectors and climbed into the cloudy skies with the knowledge that every move had been foreseen. The first wave of German bombers neared the coast. Radar blips danced across screens and plotting markers advanced steadily inland. Dowding's strategy became clear. Conserve fighters, allow the bombers to penetrate, then intercept with concentrated force. When Spitfires finally engaged the enemy, it was as if the invisible shield of radar had funneled the Luftwaffe into the exact locations where British pilots could strike with maximum effect. Flares burst overhead as dogfights erupted, tracer rounds cutting arcs of light through the morning fog. Bombers, expecting minimal resistance, suddenly found themselves under attack from all sides. Pilots reported the near-miraculous timing of interceptions. Without radar, they would have flown blind, vulnerable to surprise assaults. With radar, they had the advantage of foreknowledge, a rare commodity in war. At WWII, the operators watched as reports confirmed enemy losses. Relief mixed with exhaustion on their faces, though there was no celebration. They knew the Luftwaffe would regroup, strike again, and the cycle would continue. Yet each successful interception validated years of work, from Watt's initial experiments with radio waves to the sprawling network of towers now dotting the coastline. By the end of August 1940, chain home had proven its worth. Despite constant technical challenges, interference, miscalculations, and mechanical failures, the system allowed Britain to fight the Luftwaffe on terms favorable to the defenders. The network transformed raw radar data into actionable intelligence, creating a layered defense that overwhelmed enemy planners. Even as bombs fell on London, operators at the coastal stations maintained vigilance. The air was thick with smoke, yet they remained focused, a quiet, unseen army guarding the nation. Watt often reflected that the true battle was not only fought in the skies, but in these rooms, where knowledge and technology converged to create an invisible shield. October 3rd, 1940. The autumn wind cut through the trenches of Kent, carrying a scent of salt from the Channel and smoke from distant fires. While the Battle of Britain raged above, the chain home network faced pressures unseen by pilots in the sky. Operators and engineers labored day and night, balancing technical innovation with the harsh realities of wartime Britain. Every day brought new challenges, from equipment malfunctions to enemy countermeasures, and each solution demanded ingenuity. At Bawdsey Manor, now a hub of innovation and secrecy, technicians wrestled with transmitter failures and receiver sensitivity. Oscilloscopes hummed, cathode rays flickered, and the smell of ozone mingled with solder and oil. The original chain home towers had been designed for detection at high altitudes, but Luftwaffe tactics evolved. Bombers began flying lower to evade detection, forcing engineers to recalibrate antennas, boost transmitter power, and experiment with different wavelengths. Lower your angle of incidence, adjust for ground clutter, Watt instructed, leaning over a young engineer's shoulder. If we lose the blips in the static, we lose lives. His voice was calm, but each word carried urgency. The team moved swiftly, scribbling calculations on blackboards, resoldering circuits, and adjusting the mechanical goniometers that determined bearing accuracy. Meanwhile, in the field, chain home low stations were being built to detect low-flying aircraft. Wooden towers rose against the gray skies, operators climbing ladders through wind and rain to reach the top of the platforms. Each station expanded the protective shield, filling gaps in coverage and providing redundancy in case of enemy attack. Aerial photographs and reconnaissance reports guided placement, ensuring that every vulnerable coastline and industrial target had overlapping radar protection. Technical ingenuity was matched by human ingenuity. Operators developed codes, protocols, and shorthand to relay sightings to fighter command efficiently. Even minor errors could lead to missed interceptions, so drills were frequent and precise. Cadets and new recruits were trained to anticipate radar echoes, predict enemy flight paths, and communicate with both composure and speed. Watson Watt emphasized the human element repeatedly. The machine only tells us what is. It is your judgment that decides what happens next. By late 1940, radar technology had begun to evolve into early warning for night raids. The Luftwaffe, frustrated by British interception, shifted to nocturnal bombing. Engineers responded with improvements to radar receivers, filters to reduce interference, and better plotting methods for tracking multiple aircraft simultaneously. Diagrams of radio wave propagation, once confined to laboratory notebooks, became essential visual tools for operators, helping them interpret complex patterns and anticipate enemy maneuvers. Expanding radar coverage also demanded secrecy. German intelligence probed the coastline, seeking to locate and destroy the towers. Camouflage became essential. Wooden frameworks were disguised as farm buildings, water towers, or simple sheds. Operators learned to operate under blackout conditions, with lights minimized and signals transmitted securely. The invisible shield was as much about concealment as detection. Beyond technical challenges, morale and logistics presented constant obstacles. Operators endured long hours, harsh weather, and the isolation of remote stations. Communications with fighter command had to be maintained despite disrupted lines or sporadic interference. Food and supplies were rationed, and yet precision could not falter. Every wave of enemy aircraft that passed over the channel relied on their accuracy, their diligence, and their resolve. Through this pressure cooker of innovation, radar matured into a critical instrument of British defense. The chain-home network, once a theoretical experiment, now stood as a sprawling electronic web. Its successes were evident in the battles of August and September, but its importance extended beyond individual skirmishes. It was an evolving system, learning, adapting, and improving as the war demanded. By the end of 1940, the combination of technology and human skill had transformed radar from a novel experiment into the backbone of Britain's early warning strategy. It was no longer just a tower in a field. It was the sentinel that gave the RAF the edge to survive and eventually dominate the skies over their homeland. May 10th, 1941. Dawn broke over southern England, painting the fields with a pale wash of light. From the wooden towers and steel lattice structures of the chain-home network, operators scanned the skies with the calm focus born of countless hours of vigilance. Radar had evolved from an experimental curiosity into Britain's most vital defensive weapon, a silent guardian in a war defined by noise, fire, and destruction. The impact of radar was not confined to the Battle of Britain. Its reach extended across the war, influencing planning, tactics, and strategy. Fighter command now relied on early warning to allocate squadrons efficiently, intercepting Luftwaffe raids before they could inflict catastrophic damage. Pilots, guided by controllers in operations rooms, trusted the invisible eyes of radar as they scrambled from airfields like Tangmere and Biggin Hill. They knew the electronic web would give them the edge, and often it did. Radar's influence rippled further still. Coastal Command employed it to track U-boats, while anti-aircraft batteries integrated radar for precise targeting, increasing their lethality against night bombers. Even experimental microwave radar, still in its infancy, hinted at the future of detection and electronic warfare. The chain of towers that had begun in the quiet countryside now served as the backbone of Britain's broader technological offensive. Yet the true triumph of radar was the human story intertwined with its technology. Operators, many barely out of school, handled complex electronics under immense pressure. They interpreted blips on cathode ray screens, communicated with fighter squadrons, and made split-second decisions that could save or doom lives. Engineers continued refining transmitters and receivers, often improvising in the field with scrap metal and vacuum tubes. The synergy between human ingenuity and technical innovation became a hallmark of British resilience. The war also demonstrated the value of secrecy. The Germans never fully understood the chain-home network until it was too late. Even when they suspected, they could not neutralize it. Its spread, redundancy, and concealment made it a near impenetrable web of defense. La Souris, as some engineers jokingly referred to it, moved unseen, thwarting attacks before the enemy even knew Britain was ready. In retrospect, radar's success reshaped warfare. Air defense was no longer purely about pilot skill or gunfire. It became a game of information, anticipation, and coordination. Britain's early warning network proved that technology, wielded intelligently, could compensate for numerical inferiority and tip the scales in the crucible of battle. Robert Watson Watt's vision, nurtured through trial, error, and relentless determination, had produced a tool that changed the very nature of combat. By 1943, radar's principles had been adapted and exported across Allied forces. Mobile units, advanced receivers, and new plotting techniques helped protect North Africa, the Mediterranean, and eventually the skies over Normandy during D-Day. The invisible shield that began over the fields of southern England became a global instrument of war, saving countless lives and allowing coordinated strikes against the Axis with unprecedented precision. As the war drew to a close, the chain-home towers stood not merely as relics of technology, but as monuments to human collaboration, ingenuity, and courage. Engineers, operators, and pilots alike remembered the nights when the hiss of static and the glow of cathode rays were the difference between life and death. The story of radar was more than circuitry and waves. It was a testament to what could be achieved when minds, machines, and purpose aligned in defense of a nation. In London, as air raid sirens finally fell silent and the city began to rebuild, Robert Watson Watt looked at the network he had helped create. "We gave them warning," he said quietly. "And in doing so, we gave them hope." Across Britain, from the towers that still scraped the sky to the operators who had once held their breath before the crackle of transmission, the legacy of radar endured. It was the invisible shield that had turned the tide, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one you cannot see.